Expose objects. Hey, Burgess. Hey. Wait. Avails. Don't take it with it. Mike.
Hey.
Okay, I found fruit for later, which is good. Steady diet carbs. Yeah, it's not my friend.
Yep.
But looks like Randy's set up in the back.
Yep, I think we're ready.
Let's should start. Did you get blue sheets around already?
Yeah, the blue sheets are going.
Okay.
Okay, everybody, let's get this goat rodeo going. We're now 3 minutes after our official start time, and we've got a lot to get through. So, point number one, as nagged a few times on the mailing list, is please hop onto Etherpad. We do have a volunteer. Thank you, Ignace, for taking notes, but let's not make him do it all by himself. And in particular, I at least find Etherpad to work very well if you have made a comment at the mic to go in and make sure that it's reflected accurately, make sure your name is spelled right. If you want to contribute in other ways as well at the same time, it's a great idea. The note well, this is the thing that you've clicked through a million times in the click wrap when you registered for the meeting and so on, but it actually is important, so hopefully you've read it at least once, and if you haven't, go read it, not during the meeting, maybe right afterward. Turns out that we've been a pretty busy group. We have 2 new RFCs. Well, when I started to write this slide, I thought we had finished working group last call for large communities, but then it turned out there was probably just enough that it warranted extending it. I would rather spend a little longer on working group last call than too short of a time. There's already been quite a lot of conversation on that. If you haven't looked in on it already, please do. We have 2 new working group documents, one of which I at least think we maybe should start working group last call on, which is the deprecation thing, which, I mean, gosh, I don't really think there's any further polishing to be done. Actually, can I ask for any comments at the mic or sort of a sense of the room about should we start that working group last call? I'm seeing head nodding and nobody's jumping up to say no, so I think that, I mean, you know, anybody who objects can also object on the list, so we'll just start that. Right, the infamous implementation requirement. We have at least 2 things that are hung up on, you know, they've been through last call, but we don't have implementation reports for them. That's the URL for filing implementation reports. It's fairly painless. If you have an implementation and editing the wiki is not your thing, feel free to talk to the chair, send us email. Also, Jeff observed that large community has overtaken the need for generic subtype for 4-octet AS. So instead of continuing to carry that around as vestigial tissue in our list of working group documents, why don't we just move it to the dead state? So we put out a call for that on the list. Nobody objected, so we'll do it. There's only one pending work item there, which is to go talk to IANA about there are some associated code points, and you know, while we're deprecating things, we probably should deprecate those too if we're going to move the draft to dead. So we just need to go and talk to IANA about what the right way is to, you know, what kind of documentation they require for that. I'm kind of hoping that we can just update the draft one more time and, you know, change the IANA section to say, oh, you had allocated us these code points, but now we want you to deprecate them. It seems like that would be a fairly painless way to do it. Speaking of the wiki, we have this wiki. It kind of feels like it's a write-only document because various people keep writing documents, internet drafts that ignore all the advice that's there. There's, for example, a short little checklist on, you know, things to think about while you're writing an internet draft, and it has an explicit section on things you shouldn't do with code points, which half the people in this room turn out to have done, probably including me. There's a checklist for things to do when presenting at a meeting. There is also a section that's really just started to provide, you know, advice and comments about RFCs. And this is kind of intended to be, sometimes RFCs have things that are, you can tell they're not clear because people keep asking about them on the list. They're not errata because the RFC isn't wrong. They're not things that you really want to spin a whole new RFC for, which is a fairly expensive process. So we have this other place to, it's sort of intended as here, this is advice for, maybe you could go look at this before you ask the question on the list again. And it's a wiki, it's your wiki. You all are actually allowed to edit it also. So in a couple meetings back, Sue and I were encouraged by our ADs to also start in our wiki. I mean, it wasn't just us; it was all the working group, all the routing area working groups have been encouraged to, document your document, create a wiki article that provides a document set map. We have a fairly large document set, so I suspect that newcomers would be well served by having that document set map and an architectural overview. If any of you feels motivated to create a skeleton, contribute to such a document, it would be much appreciated. You can just do it. You can come talk to the chairs about it. I suppose we could put together a formal design team to do it. We don't have more minutes to talk about it right now, but the chairs are not going to sit down and do this work. But we certainly would advise, help, and consult, do some of the work, but volunteers are needed. So I started trying to take our agenda. It's published online, trying to stick it up on a PowerPoint thing, produced a complete eye chart, so forget about it. We have 2 hours and 40 minutes allocated out of our 2 hours and 30 minutes, so I'm going to stop talking and let's get this goat rodeo on the road. I will apologize in advance for watching the clock and telling people that they have to stop talking because they've used up their time. And I will try to give you if you're speaking, the 2 minutes and the 1 minute, and that includes any Q&A time. So you might want, so maybe I'll give you a 3 minutes, a 2 minutes, and a 1 minute. And there we go. So Job and Jacob. This is the clicker. You can click on it.
Okay, hi. In case you haven't been reading the email mailing list, what we did is we took the BGP communities and we made them 12 bytes long because they were too short. We need to put 4-byte ASs in. Thank you, Kayo. So it's more than just 4-byte AS. After we have the 4-byte AS, we wanted to have another 4 bytes for an action and another 4 bytes to put what we want, the target. So that makes 12 bytes. Okay. So there's the encoding. There was a lot of talk on the list about whether we should have the first 4 bytes to actually must be an ASN. That is usually the case, that it must be an ASN. Okay. However, in private settings, it does not need to be an ASN, but it's recommended that it should be an ASN. So, but the important thing here is that an implementation of vendor code should not be throwing it out if it's not an ASN. Right, the canonical representation. It is important that we specify in documents and in the routing policy language of the code in the same ways so that we can all read it, so that an ISP can publish its communities, and when you enter it in at the routing policy language, it enters in the same way. So we settled on it is a non-negative decimal integers, so 3 non-negative decimal integers. They are separated by colons usually. However, if they're not, if there was an implementation that does not use colons for other reasons, and that's fine. So we allow that. And I have here why it matters, and there's a link there to this one-step website. Has a list of a whole lot of autonomous systems and their community specifications, and you can have a look at that. It's Job's turn.
I'm Job Snyders. I work for NTT. One of the arguments for large communities was that we have plenty of code path attributes to burn, but it turns out that we need triple the amount to settle on a good code point. Some of you might have followed this on the list, but large communities' first code attribute assignment turned out to be squatted on by a certain vendor. Another vendor proactively informed the group that they were squatting on 31. So that's why IANA eventually gave this project 32. And I would like to dive into how we discovered this and give some recommendations to the group for future work if they end up with an optional transitive attribute. The key element, how we discovered these squattings, is dogfooding. The moment IANA gave the path attribute code to us saying you can use this for large communities, I immediately slapped it on a prefix and started announcing this into the default free zone. When I did so, I informed various operational communities such as NANOC and the routing working group of RIPE that this beacon prefix with this special attribute is now in the default free zone. I also provided those communities with clear contact details who to reach out to make it stop in case, for instance, routers start crashing. And the people manning those mailboxes and phones were also instructed what to do when they receive a phone call that is screaming to them, "Stop this experiment, you know, no questions asked, just shut down this specific BGP session." And when you start with a beacon prefix, the assumption is, because it's optional transitive, that the prefix will propagate to all places of the planet, and they should be visible in things like the RIPE RIS, or you can measure reachability with RIPE Atlas. But that's not enough, we've noticed. We've noticed that you need to put real users behind these beacon prefixes. This literally was my task lab. I have a dog and a partner at home, and we sat behind the prefix, and my partner discovered that she couldn't reach certain websites that the day before we attached the attribute to the prefix, she could reach. And I engaged the Dutch network community because it happened to be a Dutch web hosting company that could no longer talk to our prefix. And we quite quickly correlated certain news announcements they had made in the weeks prior that they were using Huawei routers. And then I asked the TerraStream people, thank you TerraStream, hey, you have these devices, can you replicate this in your lab? And within a few hours, we had strong confirmation that something funky was going on. But this was quite subtle in terms of reachability. If I had just only looked at RIPE Atlas data, this would not have stood out. And what the issue was with 30, the code point was squatted, meaning that the vendor implemented a different feature on attribute 30. And the device that received my beacon announcement compared the length of the attribute with its expected length and concluded that the attribute was corrupt. And therefore, it treated as withdrawal, meaning it had no route towards my prefix or no path towards my prefix. And some people in operational communities or in even on the working group mailing lists said, well, that vendor should just get off the code point and large should railroad through this. Unfortunately, that attitude is not helpful if you look at who has most incentive to change the code point. In this particular instance, it meant that deployers of the large community would be punished because by using large communities, their prefixes would become unreachable. So unfortunately, the onus was on large community to jump to a new code point. Had the manifestation of this squatting been different, for instance, that the router which was squatting would crash upon receiving this attribute, the incentive would very much lay with the vendor to provide a fix to their customers as quick as possible. Here's a link where you can read more about the statistical analysis of the beacon prefix. Future work, what we've taken away from this. NTT, namely Jared and I, in 2017 will do active probing of the entire attribute space. And some of you might worry about this, saying, hey, my router might crash. What are you doing? Don't touch this dangerous stuff. You want to interrupt already?
Yes. I would like to clarify this will be after it is done in a test lab.
Yes. Before we engage with this active probing, we will publish documentation on what will happen, what the exact timeline is. We'll probe one attribute per day. And more importantly, we'll expose a phone number, and the moment you call that phone number and press 1, it will immediately kill the entire experiment. No questions asked. We have to jump through hoops like that. But if we don't do this in a controlled manner, if we don't do this from an organization that has multiple people 24/7 available to deal with possible fallouts, I think it would be irresponsible. But in not scanning the attribute space, we might run into more issues in the future. Other work is the deprecation draft to deprecate the 6 code points that are known to be squatted on. I would like to clarify that if an attribute is deprecated, I see no reason why it cannot be undeprecated in the future. But that, of course, would require a draft and working group consensus. And my final advice to you is, if you get an optional transitive attribute, immediately start testing. Had large community waited, say, half a year for the document to be more mature or be RFC status, it would have been far too late to jump to a new code point. So use the early allocation not only to do interrupt testing, but also to do testing with the rest of the internet. This is it.
We did name one of the vendors. We named it Huawei, so I think it's only fair to name the other one. It's Cisco.
And because free is a charm, Juniper as well.
Keyur Patel, Arcus, Job, this is really good work. I just have a quick question. When you deprecate something, what does that mean to a software that is already deployed? Does that mean that the onus is on the operators now to pull the software out?
For me, the main priority with deprecating is that it gives clear instruction to IANA not to give this number to somebody. I personally would recommend a vendor to not use deprecated code points, but I obviously have no way of forcing them. So this draft is meant to protect future work. So if we come along with large communities version 2, then these 6 code points will not be in the early allocation possibilities. So the draft, the target audience is IANA, and what you do with it, that's up to you. Any further questions?
Robin from Huawei.
Thanks for the sleepless nights.
Okay. Oh, buddy, I will be criticized by the slides. Okay. As a former architect of our IP software platform, I must admit that we made a mistake, and we should do a good rule compiler. Yeah, we should do complying the rules of IETF. Yeah. So this one is the comments, and also Huawei sent the apology letters in the mailing list for apology, and also we explain the reason. Okay, and because you know, at that time data center solution move very fast. You know, now that many data center, I think the DCN network SDN-based solution is very popular in the industry. But at that time, we must to find some solutions. But at that time, EVPN is not mature. And also one important draft proposed by the remote next hop is proposed. So we must choose the possible solution for the customer. So by that time, we have to determine what to do. Yeah, so that's the we choose the 30.
So just in interest of time, let me say that we have 2 more talks coming up that are also talking about code point management. I think some of this, sort of the general area, not this particular incident, will be discussed then, and you know, sort of what we should be working toward as best practices and so on. So thanks for that statement and providing the background, and I'm hoping that we can continue forth. If you want to make your comment, please go ahead.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
John, can I add some of this information?
If it's quick.
Okay, I will be very quick. Okay, this one, I think, in fact, now I'm working on the SDN controller as the architect of the SDN. So now you know that is customer requirement moves very, very faster than our standard.
Yep, you know what? Let me cut you off there and ask you, hold that thought. As you know, Jeff has a proposal that may or may not address what I think you're getting towards. If it doesn't, you know, we can continue the discussion then, but we're out of time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I think Jeff's up then. Thank you, Jacob.
Thank you.
Joe.
I just want to say thanks to the whole team that did the large communities thing, and is continuing to do it. It's been an interesting experience, and I think a good one.
It's really helpful to hear what operators need now. So we hope you continue to speak up and say you're not moving fast enough.
Where's the clicker, please?
I have a clicker.
Oh.
I have slides.
Click forward.
Oh, thank you. Hi, my name is Jeff Haas. I'm going to be giving a version of a presentation that we give internally at Juniper Networks. This presentation goes out not only to senior engineers doing IETF work, but also our junior engineers as well. It's worth pointing out that, to set the expectations, this talk is subtitled internally, "Stop Making Customers Regret Early Deployment." So the motivation of this point is that code point allocations have impact. Now, we just spent a bunch of time working through this, so I won't belabor the point. Allocation practices really do matter. The question is where they do matter. Some code point allocations are local. For example, something in LDP that's affecting only adjacent routers has limited impact. In the case of BGP, address families that are local between 2 routers also have local impact. Some other things like path attributes, potentially communities, they potentially can have global impact. The real issue here is what is the blast radius of doing the wrong thing? Obviously, if you're doing a protocol, you have to have code points to do stuff with it. You need to use them as enumerations. When we're doing completely brand new protocols, it's easy. You can do whatever you want to. This is a known thing. Most of our headaches are related to the maintenance of things, in terms of how do we actually maintain the registries, and more importantly, how do we select stuff from them. In the case of IETF, the majority of our registries are now done with IANA. That's not always going to be the case. Some registries come from places like ITU and also IEEE. I'm not going to belabor all these points. This is from our RFC that actually covers the different styles of registries. As you can see, there's a ton of them. The majority of these things are just simply not applicable to the work that we do here in IDR. So why are we having this conversation? As I mentioned, this is originally developed, sent as a presentation towards our developers. As people who are doing protocol design work, this is just as important for you to understand to help developers. If you have to choose a code point, the question is, what do you choose? And keeping in mind that when you choose something, that your choice will have long-reaching impact. The question is, what happens if you choose one and you're wrong? I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on this slide because we know exactly what happens. Publicly squatting is what tends to happen right now in path attributes because there's not a lot of choice to not do so. And I'll get to examples of what we might be able to do about that as next presentation.
Jeff, some people say that it's also because we move too slow. If that's the case and you have a legitimate early allocation, please, we hope this exercise will let you know that that should not be an issue. Come and talk to the chairs immediately.
Exactly. And that's also later in the presentation. So obviously Job's presentation covered, what happens when you're wrong. And Sue did make a last bullet point here that 30 and 129 both were apparently impacts of the hackathon that we have. So please, when you're doing hackathon work, keep in mind what happens if you accidentally deploy this code. Now, of course, there's a different issue, and this is one that my employer has to own up to. What happens when you pick one and you ship a feature before it is absolutely cooked? This is actually a thing that I'll say in response to one of Job's points. If you ship a feature and it's a stable one, you're great. They'll definitely do probes. The problem is if the packet format does end up changing over the lifetime of the feature, you're in exactly the same bad situation you're in as if somebody's squatting on the point. The independent domain feature, Adder 128, started off with a 2-byte AS number in the field. It went to a 4-byte, and the features were incompatible. And we had global outages when these things interacted. And this is a case where the feature is considered by many people to be toxic as a side effect of this. So what do you do? The majority of the code spaces that we have, in many cases, especially since the changes that led to 5226, are first come, first serve. They're easy to get. Getting one is a trivial process that takes less than 2 weeks in most cases. It's just what we should do. We do, however, have more restrictive policies, and that does include the path attribute code points, single byte restricted space, so we can't go quite as easy as first come, first serve. Quick question?
Yes, Michael Abrams. So does IDR own this registry and only documents that come through here can allocate from these code points, or can any working group do this?
Here's one answer.
The IDR attributes are owned by the IDR working group.
Because I have seen stuff in 6-man. There are documents that they went for review in 6-man, but document did not come out of 6-man that did like RA type codes, right? Route advertisement and so. So is this actually a thing?
So I'll let the AD speak.
I will work on that. So no, whatever RC that defines the registry defines the registration policy. So if it's specification required, for example, it means it needs an RFC that was approved by the ASG. That doesn't have to come from IDR.
Right. So
if
okay, thank you. Yeah. Right.
Right. So if I see that, I don't know, whatever, some applications area working group is trying to allocate a BGP parameter, me as the routing AD should probably do something about that, right? Make sure that it's reviewed here, raise the flag, tell them it's the wrong registry, whatever we have to do. But no, not only IDR can allocate or can request allocation.
So let me
Anyone
add one
can,
thing.
but-
We have in the past talked about adding a designated expert to some of these registries where, you know, and then that gives you a gatekeeper who at least has the opportunity to say, by the way, but we haven't done it.
Yes, and I think some of the registration policies, and I'm going to look at Michelle, is that specification required that you need a designated expert at the same time? Yes. So specification required, you have to have a designated expert anyways. So even if it's a standard RFC that went through a working group, last call, everything, the IAG approved and all that stuff, IANA still has a designated expert, which in this case, if the working group set up the registry, me as the AD would ask someone maybe from the working group to be the expert. So let's
So
say
what
you
is
are the
this,
expert.
what is the
So-
status of the BGP attribute?
I'm sorry?
Would you provide the status, Alvaro, of the BGP attribute registry that currently exists?
Provide the status.
What is the IANA status? Does it require a standard?
It's-
Was it required? You left out the basic information, which is what is the current status? Is it?
I don't remember what the current
Standards
That's what
action.
standard section. Okay, so standard section, so that means there should be a standard RFC, not just any RFC, right? So it depends on what the thing is. You listed 20 different ways of doing it, but no, the registry, anyone can allocate things from the registry. So the expert and the AD and whatever
So-
would be the ones who can
So
channel
what
the work to
prevents-
be discussed.
So
in
what
this-
prevents it from going random? The IDR working group has no input on it? Is that what you just said?
No. So what I'm saying is that if some other working group requests a BGP parameter, for example, right, what would happen is, of course, whoever's going to look at that, it gets to the ASG. At that point, I review that draft. In the worst case, what would happen is I would check it and I would say, oh, look at that. Here's the SIP working group requiring some BGP parameter. That doesn't sound right. In the worst case, what I would, or not the worst case, so some of the things that I can do is, of course, say no. Maybe there's a designated expert. Maybe I say at least come to IDR and have them review it. You got the wrong registry. There's going to be things that I would do, right? It could be, I don't know the case, it could be that it's okay for someone else to request a BGP parameter for some reason. Ideally, at that point, if that was okay, IDR would have seen the draft. There would have been review from the working group. Maybe I joined last call, something like that.
So what you're saying is the ISG has control of the attribute registry.
No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that when it gets there, that's where some of the stop measures or controls or other things would happen. So to that point, when you define your registry, you have to be very specific as to what you want to do, right? If you say first come, first serve, for example, well, first come, first serve. Whoever comes gets the number first, right?
So speaking as the designated clock watcher, I would like to cut
Take
this
that off.
conversation
I'm happy
off,
to.
but let's talk about it some more later this week because it's in the category of important but boring.
Thank you. 3 minutes later. So as is pointed out, path attributes are in the standards action. They do require no expert review. In this case, IDR is the general expert if it doesn't devolve to our AD. That is not meant to be a complete stopgap. Stopping gate to keep you from getting work done. Early allocation does exist. Michelle did point out earlier that it's RFC 7120 that actually provides for that procedure. This means that work can proceed. I'll get to that a little bit later. The last point is exactly what Sue is talking about, that this whole thing is partially problematic because the RFC process is a slow thing. So this is the advice to people trying to actually write code. No, that's new. What do you do until you can get a real assignment? In many cases, registries have an experimental code point. Path attributes in BGP have exactly one. That doesn't leave us with a lot of work to do. The next presentation talks about what we might be able to do about that. You can use those as you wish. That does mean that for your internal experiments, you must coordinate things, because if everything's using path attribute 255 and it's disagreeing with what that means, well, it's exactly the same problem that you'd have in the internet. The problem is for anything that's an experiment, you can't ship the code that way, just because it's still going to cause exactly the same problem we're talking about, although realistically, might be reasonable for us to say that you should drop the contents of 255 no matter what. But the important thing is you do have to have some sort of migration strategy. If we can't get a first come, first serve, or can't use an experimental one, squatting is what basically has to happen right now. And the problem is, that's problematic. You still can do it for development purposes. You can't ship the code. This is the problem we ran into, is that early code happens. You can't allow it to get it out in the field. And more importantly, you have to have a migration strategy built into the code that allows you to get off of that code point. So until you get a real assignment, oops, the next point. The clicker has stopped.
There, I clicked it forward.
So life cycle. If you're trying to write code, you just want to get a number, especially if you're a developer. You don't want to be tied up in all this IETF political stuff. It's just not what you're caring about. Ideally, you're going to choose an appropriate number. The experimental number is a great one. If you have to squat on a code point, you must require some sort of configuration to enable the feature. So part of the problem is, some of these early features that happen did not actually generate routes into the default free zone that had these path attributes. It was when when BGP routes passed through the boxes that we ran into the problem. So in such a case, if the feature was disabled, even if it was squatting on it internally, it should have just ignored it. And while it's tempting to use default numbers, don't do that. Provide a knob that allows you to set what that code point is going to be. There is an interesting headache about that, though. It is dangerous, in my opinion, to actually ship code that has these configuration knobs, because those configuration knobs effectively allow an arbitrary customer to do exactly the same code point squatting that we're complaining about. Policy considerations. What do I do with my spec? Eric Rosen likes to say that he has a libertarian style for this sort of thing, and I somewhat agree with him. As much as possible, first come, first serve probably makes sense. If there is a really good reason inside of your PDU to have a really tight code point space, that's fine, but if so, you may have to go with something besides first come, first serve. If you're designing your PDU format and you have the luxury of giving it a little bit of room to breathe, a larger code point space, just simply 1 extra byte is enough to allow you to do first come, first serve, and just not worry about this problem. Review considerations. Code. Code points are often scattered around the code. One of the things that you should do, and this is something that we have not completed ourselves, centralize your code points into specific files that deserve additional scrutiny from somebody who is IETF facing within your organization. That way, if you have the path attribute code points inside of one of your files and it's in a separate review process, you hopefully do not ship, in that case, something that is not ready via standards. Ideally, you do all your release process so it's tied up, that review blocks the shipment from happening. This is obviously process stuff. Programmers can be clever or stupid and just throw a pound define somewhere in some other file to get the work get done. You can run exactly the same thing, but ideally by having them centralized, you encourage people to do the right thing. And your expert reviewers hopefully have some amount of IETF exposure. That means that you, the people in this room, hopefully are participating at least that portion of the reviews.
That's 15 minutes, by the way, but manage your
last slide. So in specifications, never create a field without creating the registry. If you are reviewing the draft, and this is especially true for adoption and also last call, verify that the registries are exactly as expected. Ideally choose first come, first serve, or standards actions unless there is a really good reason not to do so. Leave a couple experimental points around just to allow people to not have to worry about using real points to play around. Anything that's a policy speed bump is going to slow stuff down. Don't do that if you can't help it. This is a pet peeve. Please refer to code to your features by the feature name rather than a code point. The example I like to give is OSPF, where it's type 5, type 7 LSAs are a special magic thing that everybody does. OSPF does. I never can remember exactly what they are. When you refer to features by code point, that sort of cements their existence there as a thing. Whereas if you refer to them by feature, that means that they can be renumbered over the life of the document. IANA is incredibly pleasant to deal with. They are very helpful. They staff stuff outside the room here, and they're happy to help you actually get stuff done. And last point is that the document shepherd, part of their work should be verifying the registries. And a point that was made at a prior meeting presenting this is that even if we have internet drafts that are not under adoption call but are active documents, this happens. People should be discouraged from actually squatting on top of code points in those pre-adoption documents. That's this presentation. Final questions, comments?
Very quickly, Murray Kucheravi, the working group should own the registry. You have to be careful saying that because the working groups aren't permanent. So who will own it after this working group shuts down?
So that is very typical. And when the
I know, Iana, but you can't say the working group needs to approve something if the working group will no longer exist.
You can't.
Here, Jeff has an answer.
Yeah, when working groups close, it goes up to the responsible AD. That's just the thing. Don't have to say that. Okay. So moving into the next presentation, this is relatively short. I have left the majority of the time available for discussion, and if we have no discussion, we can just go back to give a few minutes back to the chairs. So we just got done talking about what do you do to do feature development, and that experimental code points aren't big enough right now in path attribute space. Well, we need to actually have a place to do it. 255 is not good enough right now. So the question is, how do we actually give us some space that avoids collisions and also gives us some flexibility to deal with the fact that features develop over time, and over that development may shift format. So this is something that was haunting me in my sleep, and I rattled off a quick internet draft 2 hours on a Sunday. General idea is that for path attributes, we should just encapsulate them. And that more importantly, we should encourage them to be filtered. Hannes, quick question.
Hannes Kedler, RTBrick. Actually, in ISIS, we having such an attribute, right? It's great. It's even RFC state, and nobody is using that.
Keyur Patel, Arcus. I think the problem you have is that you only have one code point. Why don't you just expand it and let us use more experimental bits rather than have this? Because the downside of this approach is that when we start to really go down to an FCS mode, we have to do a code change, and it invalidates a bit of a testing.
Oh, let me go through my last 2 slides, and then we can get there. And Jonathan Lee actually pointed out TCP also has a very similar thing. So this is a very common thing. This is not a new idea. I don't even claim that this is the right idea that we want to adopt. Again, this is a proposal to generate discussion. I'm not asking for adoption. If the working group wants to take it and adopt it, that's great. More importantly, let's talk about what the next thing is to do. The proposal I'm making is that we pick a common code point that allows everybody that wants to do PHP work to have a unique namespace. IANA enterprise numbers that are used for SMP, among other things, are free to allocate. You don't have to pay any money for them at the moment, and you can just get one. Past that point, some sort of internal feature number, some sort of version number, and this is the thing that I think is somewhat unique to my proposal at the moment. And then past that, your encapsulated code point. Like I said, PENs are free, easy to get. Feature code points, it's up to you to manage things. You haven't lost you haven't gained anything extra from that. You're still responsible for keeping your own internal code clean. The version number, I think, is somewhat unique in terms of the things that that I've seen out of other features, LDP, TCP, ISIS. Because one of the things that those features tend to do is you tend to work on a feature, and it's the shipping feature that you eventually leave in that place. Whereas what we have seen over the life of BGP is that things go through development long enough that sometimes you actually get different versions of the PDU in progress. This gives you sort of a encouragement to expose the fact that things change and you don't suffer as a side effect of it. If we didn't have a blast radius like path attributes that had such impact, we wouldn't care about this. But this is BGP, this is global, we do have to do a little bit better than some of the other protocols. John points out, very correctly, that the 3 of these things is just a really big number. So, to Keyur's point, this really is basically just a big FCFS, just in terms of the way it's structured. My proposal for this is specifically for experiments, development work. Filtering is expected. The document gives some procedure suggestions in terms of you should have to enable, this to allow the path attributes to go through. They should be thrown away by default. If we, adopt some idea like this where we allocate a space for these types of experiments, this sort of encourages us to operate in a safe by default mode. The interesting headache, no matter which one of these types of proposals we go for, that's using any sort of internal space, numbering space, is what do we do about migration? No easy answer here. If we have Cisco, Juniper, Alcatel, Huawei, GoBGP, ExaBGP, all do versions of their feature inside of their own enterprise number, at some point you have to eventually centralize on some number. This should encourage us that eventually we all end up with a mapping of the various features in their separate spaces to a common place, and then we put it into a real path attribute. And discussion point, this feature obviously could work for, this is somewhat to Robin's discussion point. When we have things that need to be fully internal, that the outside world does not need to see. He was calling it STN, but there are other applications for this sort of thing. This type of proposal also allows us to do this sort of thing as well. The only thing that really changes in that circumstance is what do we do about filtering? And one of the ways to treat this is that, again, filtering is okay. We just have to decide exactly what the filtering procedures tend to look like in a world where this thing exists. So again, what next? If the working group wants to do something with this, that's great. More importantly, I wanted to take the remaining mic time, however that long that is, to discuss things.
We have 4 minutes for conversation. Go to it.
Hi, Jeff. Joop Snijders, NTT. Thank you for putting together this idea. I do have a concern that I've also voiced on the list. If we have a problem with people not abiding the rules, then proposing extra rules or accommodating them, but still within a rules-based framework, might not work. And this could be a cultural artifact. Dutch people very much believe in if you cannot forbid it, then you shouldn't make a rule. A comment made earlier was that there's a desire that the time to market should be as short as possible. And this draft does not address that specific use case to get a code point. It's not intended to either.
It can actually address it, as the prior slide mentions. The formatting, again, allows people to do whatever they want to and gives a structured way to do that to avoid the collisions. The only thing that changes the filtering procedures. So again, to go to the prior slide's point, if you want to use this for something besides experiments, the main thing that changes is filtering procedures. We have to decide what that would mean.
So it might be worth considering not filtering this.
Possibly, or at the very least encouraging people that you can filter this, but you have to decide what the sort of blast radius is allowed to be.
Hi, I'm Sandy Murphy Parsons. Missed my chance to ask about previous presentation. What was the blocker PR slide 14?
Blocker PRs internally to Juniper is a blocking state on the problem report, which is what we use to actually track bugs. Robin?
Okay, Robin from Huawei. In fact, we already implemented the LTP mechanism based on our episode platform. We prefer the mechanism. Definitely, we will support your work. Okay.
So again, this is not a request specific adoption. This is to generate comment. My request is please think on this, take this to the list, and more importantly, take this in the context of the prior presentation. We have to do something to keep the global tables clean, just simply because of the blast radius concern. What does that solution look like? Here's one way to start thinking about it. Please offer other suggestions.
We're on the next one.
Thank you. Stefano.
Hi, Stefano Providi, Cisco. A very short update on the segment routing T policy. We are now at version 2. We have 2 more authors and contributors. Just as a short reminder on what it is, it's a new SAFI with a new NLRI advertising a policy being identified by an endpoint and a caller, and also contains 1 or more source routed paths. What we changed is essentially we made the endpoint mandatory, while in the previous version it was optional, and the binding SID now is optional while it was mandatory. The rest is a matter of just clarification text, so we didn't change anything in the behavior that we described. We added a section on the reception that contains acceptance, usability, instantiation, propagation, and description on how to steer traffic into a policy, just for clarification. We have, I think, at least 3 implementations. So I think it would be soon interesting to ask for working group adoption of the draft. And for the segment routing T policy, it's pretty much it. For the segment routing extensions in BGPLS, we just had the adoption as working group document, so it just has been resubmitted this morning. Speaking about code points, we have quite a few code points allocated in that draft. We just added in the last revision 2 more TLVs, the SRLB and the SRMS preferences. Both are coming from IGP extensions for segment routing, so we just replicated them into BGPLS. Here also we have multiple implementations. Luckily now we can have early allocation because of the number of code points. Of course, those are code points in the BGPLS registry, so we have reduced ability to screw the internet, but still we can have some fun if we do something wrong. And so the fastest we go to allocation of those code points, the best it is. That's pretty much it. Questions?
Great. It's your turn, Stefan.
Thanks, Stefano.
Okay, so this is to present an update on the FlowSpec interface set draft. So just a very quick reminder. Today with the base FlowSpec specification, you are applying a rule, and basically it will apply to all routers and whatever the interface, the traffic is coming in or coming out. So what we want to do here is to be able to add a specific information to say that this specific rule must be applied to a particular set of interface. So we are reducing the scope of the application of a particular FlowSpec rule. So we are using an extended community for this purpose, which has the following encoding. So we have a kind of group identifier, and we are able to encode the direction of the filter. So we are able to say that I want this filtering rule to be applied in the outbound way or incoming way. So what changed since the last presentation? So we received some comments from the working groups that we took into account. So the first point is that this interface set is a bit specific, because today in FlowSpec you have match criteria that are part of the NLRI, and you have actions that are extended communities. And this interface set cannot really be considered as an action because we are not applying a specific behavior here. We just want to scope something. So I think it was a comment from Robert. We are introducing this notion of scope in addition to the match and and actions. So we are able to apply a particular filtering rule on a particular scope, and one of the scope is a particular set of interface. Now, regarding the encoding, so there was some discussion also, and we finally changed the encoding. So the payload that has displayed before hasn't changed, but rather than using it was a 4-byte AES extended community, we are using now a route target where we can apply a constraint route distribution. So we are proposing here also to create a registry for all the new flow spec extended communities, and this particular route target, so the interface set route target, will be part of this new registry, and any additional flow spec action or other scope can be registered within this registry. Another comment that we had is that we were trying to describe the interaction of the flow spec route with the existing mechanism, because here we are putting the flow spec route on particular interface, so we will have to deal with the existing features on the interface, whatever it's a PBR, ACL, net flow collection or whatever. And so in the previous version, we described some examples. So for example, what priority could be done for ACL or for net flow. But it was not really a good idea because it was not possible to be really exhaustive. So here we are proposing something more generic, so telling that the flow spec processing must be done after all the existing permanent action, whatever it's inbound or outbound. You have a question, AC?
AC Lindum, yeah. What if the actions prior to this one change the interface? Does it still get applied?
Sorry, can you say it again?
What if it's an action like policy-based routing and it changes the interface?
These are flow spec actions, right?
Do you mean a static PBR rule?
Yes.
In this case, let's say that you have a flow spec outbound rule. It will not be used because your incoming action will change the outgoing interface, so your flow spec route will not be applied anymore.
So it would still be filtered if it were an inbound.
If it is inbound, yes, it will be processed. We are also adding, just for information purpose, the ongoing work on FlowSpec v2, which may provide more guidance on the precedence rules, but it's more applicable for FlowSpec v2, while this extension is essentially now for FlowSpec, the usual FlowSpec that is already deployed. So what are the next steps? So we are welcoming comments on this latest updates. So feel free if you have some comments. We are also starting to work on implementation. So I know that there is something that is starting on a vendor, and I'm also investigating with other vendors to start implementation. So at a certain point, maybe not now, but in a couple of weeks or months, we will need to go to early allocation to start the implementations.
So this is a private comment, not a working group call to this. In the working group, we had discussions about revision to version 1. And I think we're still discussing that. There were two parts. Part 1 was to get the errors fixed in version 1. And part 2 was to decide the ordering and the problems with the existing version 1 actions. I just want to make sure I understand this is both a version 1 action and a version 2 action. Is that correct?
Yes, it will be applicable to version 2 also.
Okay. So in that case, the third comment will come, and I hope some people have talked to me. I went to the North American operators to see if they were using FlowSpec and how that was working. Some of them suggested they just want the filters and they might want to just not enact the actions. Have you heard that discussion from people who are using your FlowSpec in your area?
No, no.
The suggestion was, I want all the filters because I want to have all the filters in FlowSpec, but I don't want any of the actions. And can you give me something that does that?
Yeah, for example, in the use case we are targeting, it's also just to filter.
Okay, thank you. Robin?
Robin from Huawei. In fact, we are, I think that is the draft we proposed that is redirect to generalized ID. I think here, because I need clarification because this draft is changed a lot comparing the previous version. But still, you know, that time when we propose the generalized ID, you know that the issue is because you say that the interface site, such things does not exist entity in the router. Maybe tomorrow we have a other site, such like a tunnel site. Can you understand this one? Someday we will also some happens like this XX set, YYY group. So what do we do?
I'm not sure to understand where you want to go.
I think, sorry, maybe my pre-English.
No, it's
okay. So I maybe after the this one I will discuss with you.
Yes,
or
yes.
maybe we'll move to the mailing list.
Okay, and we can do a diagram and you can explain. Or Jeff, you have a...
Yes, if I could attempt to interpret your question, Robin. The interface set feature works on group IDs that are very general. So if you wish to assign tunnels as a specific group ID and use your FlowSpec across just those tunnels, this feature will accommodate that. Does that help?
Okay. So after the meeting. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for helping our agenda. Albert? This is Albert's first presentation at IDR, so we welcome a newcomer. And it's your first ITF too, right, Albert?
Hello, everyone. I'm Albert Dong. I'm a colleague of Jason Hao, who is the main author of this ITF working group draft. Here I want to give a presentation about the update of this draft since the zero version. Okay. And we defined the new flags for VLAN and chink action. The actual exactly definement is in the draft. We encourage comment, and we also want the early allocation of the code point so that we can go on in our real development and deployment case. Okay. And this L2 VPN FlowSpec component types, we need to define a lot. Here we have Ethernet type, we have source MAC and destination MAC, and maybe DSCP. All these code points need to be pre-allocated. Okay. Next. We also defined the ordering of traffic filtering rules. And this is pretty much according to the initial RFC 5575. The ideas are quite same. Remain the longest prefix priority. Okay, we go up.
Go back up.
Go back. Yes. And the next steps, we already in the design phase for L2 VPN flow spec implementation in Huawei product, and we also want to implement L2 VPN flow spec server in Honest and client in Huawei product. As far as the early location of the code points, we can start the implementation, and later maybe next idea we will report back the results to the idea working group again. Thanks. Any questions? Okay.
Thank you, Albert.
I had a question. Sorry, Himanshu from Siena.
Okay.
Is this L2 VPN by BGP? Is it eVPN? Is it for?
It's
Oh,
no. It's flow spec.
Yeah, BGP flow spec for L2 VPN, not for eVPN.
Okay, but you're doing the L2 VPN using BGP signaling?
Oh, not signaling, just flow spec. Flow spec. So from the server, we can ask the client to do some action using.
This is asking egress P asking the ingress P to do some VLAN tag translation.
Not like that. We have the BGP flow spec server, which can ask its client to do BGP to do the flow spec, match the flow and doing the action.
Okay.
Just like the IFC 55 or 75.
Okay.
Himanshu, it's an approved working group document on flow spec for L2 VPN and a particular flow. It is not any L2 signaling other than the filters. That's what he's talking about. Is that, yeah, it's not signaling, it's just flow spec. Okay.
Robin from Huawei. Himanshu. In fact, this already several times be presented is IETF working group draft. So maybe you are not aware of this one. We know that you are familiar with the L2 VPN. Definitely we will talk after the meeting. Okay. Okay. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you, Albert.
Peter.
Peter? Thank you, Peter.
If you need some more time for your email, it's okay.
Okay. Hey everyone, Peter, Facebook. So the talk today is about ECMP and BGP, the topic which seems to be pretty obvious to many, but operationally there are some caveats which we hit over the last few years. Is there a clicker?
Oh, here you go.
Thanks. So first of all, equal cost multipath is very well understood conceptually. You take BGP process, you stop at some point, and you take all these paths as equal. Logic is straightforward. However, there's no ever defined standard to do this thing. Pretty much it was like, hey, seems easy, let's do this. And everyone did it in more or less consistent way, but we hit some caveats that I'm going to go over briefly in the next few slides. All right, so first of all, the number of ECMP paths, it seems to be pretty straightforward config parameter, but when everyone had different tweaking norms, like, hey, how many eBGP paths or iBGP paths to set up, and often with different settings, and quite often there was also misunderstanding, oh, okay, with this many ECMP paths and this many paths to advertise an add path, how should they align, and so on and so forth. So clarifying this thing would have helped, specifically just in relation with add path. eBGP multipath seems to be the easiest one, right? So you take the eBGP paths, seems to be straightforward. So first caveat, people did this differently initially. Like some people require you to compare the SPF content to be the same. When somebody did, okay, it makes sense to only compare the lengths and also PRS and so on and so forth. This was never clarified, and you see different knobs and different implementations, and often this gets some confusion. Like I think Cisco called this
SPF relax. Juniper has some our terminology, and sometimes trying to bridge this together was non-trivial. Next thing, eBGP and IBG on path. So obviously eBGP is IBGP, right? But then there's some scenarios where it's great to be able to ECMP over eBGP and IBGP paths. Of course, this requires you to have something like MPLS, because otherwise you definitely hit routing loop. This was never clarified anywhere. Great. Is a feature well known in documentation. I think both vendors, well, let's say well-known vendors have this feature. No documentation publicly standardized anywhere. Ignore IGP cost. Well, it seems like a bad idea. However, there are ways to do this. Like people have these knobs. It's useful often to be able to choose multiple egress paths, ignoring the IGP cost. Once again, all these nice, great tricks are only possible if you have MPLS or IP tunnels or something else. All right, now the fun part. So we start doing the BGP data center. We removed all the IGPs. Seems like pretty, I won't say very natural, but an easy change, but comes out for some caveats there. So first of all, we tried IBGP a while ago. Seems like easy. IBGP is nice. There's no S numbers, same AS everywhere. Comes out pretty much every vendor never compares, say, cluster list or confed SPF lengths when trying to pick up ECMP paths. It seems like people always rely on IGP as the tiebreaker in the loop prevention logic, which makes total sense. But when you don't have IGP, you have to use something else. And this was never standardized anywhere. And we definitely hit the routing loops now with any cast traffic. So this is well known, I think, documenting working group. I don't think it ever progressed to a standard. It was kind of abandoned for some time. It's a great idea, which people like a lot. There are caveats in implementation, specifically in the data plane. How a control plane is supposed to be simple. Once again, not standardized fully. It would be great to have this finished because there are use cases in data center, in the edge, in the backbone, with well understood caveats, but also great possibilities to be used. Once again, it's a separate document. It would be just great to be able to tie together the ECMP logic and DMZ bandwidth attribute. And so there's a bunch of other stuff. This AIGP, never clarified how do ECMP there. Seems to be logical. Okay, compare the IGP costs, great, so on and so forth, right? Crazy stuff like if you have confeds and IBGP together on the same box. I mean, no one tried that until somebody did. And then again, it seems like, okay, IBGP and confeds should be the same, but then how would you actually do ECMP all these together, right? It gets worse if you don't have an IGP. You have confeds, you have IBGP, no IGP. What should you do, right? Now next hops, right? eBGP paths and next hops cost also unclarified. Seems like people either use the same cost or zero cost. If you have static routes, how would you do this together, right? Well, most cases are pretty obvious to figure out logically. Sometimes people do wrong. Anyways, this one last thing, non-terminus tie breaking. There are some implementations still in the wild that actually use oldest route, not the lowest router ID. And this causes very interesting interop issues, specifically in ECMP cases. It's not definitely ECMP problem. It's just interop problem. It's just really funny that this thing still exists in the wild. Okay, so that's pretty much it. It was a very short summary of the facts we hit in production. As I said, some of this stuff is documented in Weather docs. There is no single reference explaining what this means and how this works. It would be really great to have, let's say, not a standard, but truly a official document that explains these things, how they're done and why they're done this way, right? I would say specifically the why part is important because often people have like, oh, why do we use the same PRS? Or why do we have to compare the SPF contents, right? And so the question I had, does it make sense to adopt this as a worker document or look somewhere else, say in a grow, for example, right? So that's it for me today. Thank you so much. If any questions, I'm ready to take them.
Jeff, as Peter, a quick observation, not so much a question. When I was learning BGP more years ago than I care to count, I asked some similar questions about why are these features not really documented in the RFCs, and the explanation I was given at the time by my elders was that the core spec had to be correct, and it's easier to explain, and it makes a lot of sense. But a lot of these knobs, as you point out, are only safe to do for certain topology types. A lot of the tunneling mechanisms that didn't exist at the time now exist and allow you to use some of these things in an even less safe fashion. And obviously, data center type situations have different constraints. We're using BGP for things that are not just internet core routing. So I think the lack of documentation is one part. They were known to be unsafe at the time in a lot of circumstances, and they didn't want to document things that you had to put in more than half the document as caveats. My second bit of commentary is Grow ran into a very similar issue when they were trying to document the features that were related to doing BGP AS transitions, the local AS and AS translation, that sort of thing. It bogged them down for quite some time to sort of try to shake out more than one vendor's version of how these things worked. This is a laudable bit of work. And it would be nice to see it documented, but I suspect you're going to find this is a bit bigger work than you're expecting.
Okay, thank you.
Jeff and Sarah. So anyone who tried to configure BGP in their life in multi-vendor environment had been hit by this issue. So it's due time. So question to you, whether you want to have all the knobs documented and compared and have some kind of BCP document, or to provide guidelines or what should be the default behavior in such cases, especially in combination of different features, and expect changes from vendors, how BGP behaves in particular cases.
So I don't expect changes. It would be just great to have at least standard terminology in some cases, like SPF Relax, for example, used by Cisco, right? And then make it a BCP, maybe not, more like a international document for people just to understand the caveats. I would say more like a caveat document.
You're creating kind of multi-dimensional array because different vendors stop at different stages of best path comparison to provide a CMP. It's not as easy because meaning of different keywords in CLI is different.
Oh, definitely. A CLI is it's a fair game. I would say just having conceptual explained why things are this way would be really helpful. And stuff like cluster list totally was confusing, right, for people. When we tried this first, why it was happening, it seems like people should be considering this. And they do, but when they truncate this process, apparently people just stop it.
So, I mean, people like yourself have buying power. So why don't you impose common behavior across implementation rather than just trying to document them?
Well, enforcing something is difficult. It's much easier to document the problem, and it is great awareness. That was my experience so far. Thank you.
Sean Zandy, LinkedIn. I understand that most of these things are happening on the same box, this decision process. That's why maybe it's not documented in IETF between protocols. But as operator, I just wanted to second Peter's point that it's important for us that decisions that are being made on each box is similar, not to be different between vendors. So
cool. Thank you.
Appreciate that.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, Peter.
Who's presenting? Is this Robin?
Robin, am I presenting who's presenting the RPD? Is it?
Where did Robin go?
He's right there.
Okay, there he is. He moved his chair.
I will do the MPLS path programming. Robin's a little short on sleep, guys. He had,
Yes.
Clicker.
Yeah, we are humble and also sleepy. Okay. I like to give the chance to my colleague about this. Okay, so this topic is BGP flow spec extension for routing policy distribution. Okay, so now that we get more co-authors, so I will just introduce the progress and updates of the draft. Next slide. Okay, so this is presented several times in the meeting. So from change from the latest the updates, we refine the use case because the China Telecom, they prefer the solutions based on this one because they want, I think now that a lot of operators, they would like to use the BGP to do the policy self-adjustment and steering the traffic. It seems the BGP is a powerful tools and maybe the only choice can be easily be evaluated from the old error to the new error. So now they identify the use cases as a customer, propose the draft in the working group. Okay, so that you can to identify to read this draft, so understand the use case. Next one, so that we give the implementation information. So this based on the this platform, so that we do the implementation and do the prototype and to verify the idea. Okay, next one. I think this use cases has been proposed several times. And also at the beginning, we wanted to define some of this the community attribute. But later we think is the better way to incorporate the existing work in the IDR so that we can combine the wide community attribute. So make the use cases and also the solutions to happen quickly. So we will try to, I think the wide community attribute draft existing for many years. But now I think this central controller application widely be used by the operators. So I think now we think the wide community attribute will be a powerful tools and can combine with our innovative ideas. So this is our thought on this one. Next one. Okay, so here is just the application. Since this has been proposed several times, I will not repeat this one because this is just for the typical use case for the carrier network, inbound traffic control. Okay, steering the incoming traffic of the operators. Next one. So here we give the we give these protocol extensions. Next slide. This is outbound the traffic control. Outbound the traffic control. This is steering traffic to different operators. So we think this one has a flexible steering policy, but we combine the wide community so that it is easy to solve the issue. Okay, next one. Okay, so here we give some the example that to identify the use cases and this the encoding example. Okay, next slide. So now I think that all the possible work we can do is almost done. That the use cases draft and also the appropriate way for the protocol extension, reuse the existing work. And also we do the prototype. So I think we want the working group to adopt this draft. Okay, that's all. Any comments?
You're also giving an indication that there's an implementation of wide communities that would make it ready for early allocation. I think that's the second point.
Okay, thanks. You're reminding.
Thank you, Robin.
Thank you, Robin. Robin had the previous couple slides, but now that he's working in code, he gets to stay up all night working on code. So I'm going to do the next one for him because perhaps it'll be a little easier to understand with someone who's had some sleep. Why don't you go ahead? Okay. So there have been several path programming specifications in Spring or in IDR that have described things that are happening. And the concept is trying to get some flexible label combination and trying to get mapping of services to an MPLS tunnel. Now, why is this coming to IDR? And I don't know if that was really easy to see in the last one. But the implementations are actually beginning to use pieces of the spec. It's Job's eat the dog food, right? If you try it out, eat the dog food for the new RFC 71 BIS, eat the dog food for draft ITR tunnels and the Praviti spec, and see if it works. And so this description is trying to give you the details on that, and then as the implementation progresses, this will provide some feedback. The same, I think, is what you should also take away from the previous presentation, that wide community is actually being implemented. I bet Robert's happy. I'm happy. For FlowSpec v2, and we're actually getting implementation. So we're trying to provide that eat the dog food and then report back and then say, this is reasonable. Okay. So now that I've told you what we're going to do, I'll try to give you a quick summation. Go ahead, John. Is the clicker still working? Yep. I can do it then. Okay. So this gives you a sort of picture of a centralized controller, LSPs, and a service routing, service routing. Now, I'm not as good at that, but I'm good at the BGP. So we'll show you that I'll go to Praviti or someone like that. So that was what I told Robin. Not as good on segment routing as several of you. But the important part here is that there is actually protocol extensions done in ONS. That's one of the open software platforms that people can look at. We're giving you the versions. And the verification of the code will be done in a data center. And that tries to give you a case of where it's going. This is the concept that I think I went through that. Boy, I repeated myself. But the idea is the generalized segment and the segment path is being introduced. And in one of these drafts, we're giving you the requirements. Now, what the requirements mean is this is just the way we're going to use it. The important thing for IDR is we're using component parts that you've been specifying, and we're starting to report implementation reports. So this eye chart tells you the things that are happening on both sides. I'll let you read that at home or at your leisure, but that's what these other drafts are being used to do, to have a centralized mapping distribution, both local and distributed, to be able to identify a transport MPLS path, to be able to have endpoints, to have priority setting, and in the segment routing, to be able to distribute segment bindings. Again, the important part of all of this is we're trying to use the IDR drafts in code. That's open source. That comes back to the community to eat dog food. Excuse me, I don't mean to call our code dog food, but I'm referring to Job's point that we have to actually implement, try it, see where the spec breaks out. And as we've discussed some of the parts in the tunnel encapsulation and some of the 3170 bits, some of them do not lend to easily understandable code. So that's some places where we really need to work on the drafts. It's not that the concepts are bad, but the language when you try to do the should, may, must, and does it work has some problems. Kudos. There's nothing in the last one that they found so far, but we'll be implementing and refining back to you. Okay, So that's what this whole thing is about. And for the wide communities that Robin with, that's another part of it. We're trying to provide feedback and give to the working group information on these existing drafts and get early allocation for the wide communities. Questions? AC, did I kill segment routing? Robin, anything I missed?
Okay, can you previous slides?
Which one?
Okay. No. Okay, so this one.
Yeah.
In fact, 2 years ago, my team began to do the research on this work. In fact, these several options proposed in the later draft has been discussed internally. But this option, at last, we dropped to some reason to give it up because some of these the design principles. For example, we should not confused because this may be confused because some of the segment list and the label list. Yeah, because the segment list sometimes can become the label list. So this will totally confuse the network engineer. So that's why we define the segment and the label as a different ideas or the different concepts. So this is the first principle. And the second one, and also MPLS power programming, a redirect to tunnel should be decoupled from the label list or the segment list, because some use cases redirect to the label stack. I mean, the encapsulate the label stack. They only use the use case will only use the label stack, not use the tunnel. So that's one. So we need not to mix these things all together. So next slide. Okay, but now we observe the draft is a IETF IDR tunnel encapsulation. I think the name will be misleading, maybe, because everyone seems is the tunnel encapsulation, but internally, it can incorporate too many TRAs. Yeah, the label list, and also the next draft based on the tunnel encapsulation segment list. But this seems different concept from the tunnel, because that's a label list instead of tunnel. So I think this may be misleading. So I think this is no problem, because for the past years we do the verification, we understand this one. Yeah, we do some of the prototype work, and we also try to implement based on the open source. Okay, so that's I will explain, because now that I have explained, BGP will be a very, very important tools in the new era. The central controller applications. So the for the past years, it seems.
So before you continue, Hannes, do you have something you want to respond to that Robin has just said, or should he finish making his statement and then you'll comment with yours?
Hannes, please let me finish. Okay, just a quick. Okay, so I think we are hot. BGP very hot. This is a good thing. Okay, for the BGP flow spec, we already sit here together to work out our solution. So I think for these topics, if everyone like it, we can still sit here together. And we see if we is merge one draft, or because this is a very, very big topic, one draft is not enough. So we can divide it into different pieces as an extension based on some of this the base draft. Okay, so that's my suggestion. Okay, I hope the working group can set up the, I think, get the feedback. But from my own, in my own opinion, it's better our people sit together. Say if we can set up a design team, everyone share their experience. So maybe we can work out the reasonable solution for the industry. Okay, and on the other hand, because if the solution protocol extension is justified by the IDR working group, so I want, John, you are also the Spring. Oh, no, now you are not the Spring working group chair. Sorry. Maybe, okay, I must maybe get help from AD. If this is justified, so maybe with the Spring working group, we can do something on the MPLS path programming and the segment path programming. Okay, thank you.
Hannes, did you go ahead?
Hannes Gredler, Artibrick. I try to just understand what this is. Is this a general way of mapping service prefixes to tunnel stacks?
It's mix and matching.
Okay,
And
that was not clear to me.
And I will take a deep breath and then hand you over to the coders. Robin, I may have to cut myself off as a chair, as I think we're.
Yeah, we're doing all right. Let's say 2 more minutes.
2 more. Okay. On better thought, let's talk this with Robin and the developers, because I'm not good enough to do the service chaining piece. Tell you how they're mixed and matched, Hannes. So we should take that to the guys who actually code.
Okay, so you guys are going to go sit in the bar and figure this out or something?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think
We should have that discussion
that would
there,
be necessary.
because I'm out of my depth, and I might as well just say service chaining, good for you, good for the other guys, not my expertise. Did you need something before I sit down?
Short comment. So we've been trying to do similar things in PC, where we provision segment routing tunnel over PC, and somehow traffic has to follow it. So it would be really good to work on some generalized service identifier could be used across different protocols, whether BGP or PSEP or anything else.
This is starting to sound like a barb-off. I mean, maybe you guys should just get together in the back of the room and figure out a time to sit down together.
There was also a hackathon on some of this too, example code. Excuse me, ITF, this ITF's hackathon had examples of some of this code.
Okay, so that I just want to add one comment.
Okay.
In fact, in the architecture of the MPLS path programming and the segment path programming, we propose the IGP, propose the protocol extension requirement. The protocol extension requirement is not only include the requirement of the BGP. In fact, it must be combined with some of the IGP extensions and the PSEP extensions can make the whole solution work. Okay, so that means that only the BGP extension is not enough. Please remember this one, because this solution has been prototyped by our team. Okay, so then later I will send maybe the implementation report to the working group. Okay, thank you.
That would be good. Shuan, are you doing this presentation? You have plenty of time, so speak slow.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sun Wang from Huawei. I will introduce the BGP extension for seamless BFD. Oh.
Here, hold it the other way up.
No, it's turned. Okay.
Okay. SBFD, IGP has been extended to support SBFD. Now, in our seamless MPLS network, we need to deploy the seamless BFD. But okay, we think for advertising the SBFD discriminator, which is spanned across the IGP domain, we think BGP is better. Okay. This is a simple extension. SBFD discriminator TLOV can be mapped into a TLOV node attribute. This is the coding format. The value point of the TLOV is variable and is equal to the corresponding value portion of the TLOV defined in IGP IFC. Okay, this is the use case in the seamless MPLS network. In this network, IGP can be used to extension to advise the SBFD discriminator in his area. Then we can use the BGP to advise the SBFD discriminator get from IGP. So in seamless MPLS network, in these scenarios, we can use PE1 as SBFD initiator and use the PE3 as the reflector, so we can deploy the seamless BFD on demand. Okay. Another use case is we can use the seamless BFD solution in central controlled network. This job has been presented in past meeting, and the WG has agreed to adopt this work. But main cause of this job's work has changed, so this work has been stored for a few times. Now we begin this work again. So we ask the last WG to adopt this work. Okay. Any question? Okay.
Sean, 2 questions. Could you go back to your topology slide?
Oh, this one.
Backwards. Keep going. There.
Helping.
Is it a requirement that the path be symmetric?
Oh.
So your green shows your SBFD session going to the reflector. It goes back. Do you care that it traverses the same path each direction?
Oh, I got your question. This question is in research. Maybe in some use case, the SBFD packet can go from P1 to P3, and the returned packet may be returned in different paths. Okay.
So you do not care. Thank you. My observation, and I'm wearing my BFD chair hat, I believe this extension for BGP LS is reasonable. So I think this helps. My second observation is that BGP, without BGP LS, does not currently have a way to distribute BFD discriminators for SBFD. Should this work be more general?
Okay, so I think now that is Okay, Robin from Huawei. Okay. Thanks for the Jeff's comments. Okay, so that is now that at that time, because BGP link state is not so hot. Yeah. Okay. So that, but now that maybe some of the new tools. Yeah. So I think that, but on the other hand, but I think this the requirement is existing. Yeah. So in fact, at that time, because the past meeting, my colleague is not here. Yeah. So at that time, and also you do the comments because tried to get the working group adoption. But later, some of these co-authors have a lot of change because this the hot word. Yeah. So now that the work is deleted by ourselves. Okay. Again, we apologize for this work. Okay. So that one after this meeting, so I will talk to you so that we talk about this the BFD and the BGP link state if it's okay. So we work up the possible solution. So we'll modify it. So then this try to through the mailing list get the feedback if it's okay. So for the working group adoption, if not, so we will go on to refine our draft. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
She's presenting. Did your colleague not get?
Yep.
Hi everyone, I'm Jaedong from Huawei and going to present this draft carrying the congestion status information using the BGP extended community. Okay, it is observed by some operator that knowing the congestion status of the AS exit link will be useful for the BGP speakers. One typical case is shown in this diagram in which this router X has multiple exit links to the internet, and when it knows that the exit link through the backbone network is having the congestion problem, it can steer some of the traffic to another exit link. So the similar cases are also specified in another draft from another operator. So the suggested solution to this problem is to carrying the link's congestion status information with extended community. So this because this congestion status information will be useful both inside AS and also between multiple neighboring ASs. So this should be an optional. Yeah, it is an optional transitive attribute. And for network which deployed with SDN controller, such congestion status information will help the controller to still steer the traffic, internet access traffic among all these access links because it has a global overview of the congestion of the network. And if a router reflector is deployed in the network, it is suggested to use the add pass functionality with a router reflector because to make it advertise multiple routes for the clients. So here's a suggested encoding. So basically, we will ask for a new subtype for the transitive 4-octet AS specific extended community. And this subtype field will be used to indicate this is a congestion status community. And the 4-octet AS number is used to identify the BGP speaker, which is generating this congestion information. And the 1 octet is used for the bandwidth information, which is in the unit of the GBPS. And another byte is used to carry the utilization of this exit link. The unit is the percentage. So here are some considerations of how to use this in the network. The first one is to avoid the route oscillation caused by the change of the congestion status. So the exit router should set the threshold And when this congestion status reach this threshold, it will generate a BGP update with this congestion status community. And the mechanism similar to the route flap damping is recommended for the implementations to further reduce the BGP update messages caused by this change. And another point is to avoid the traffic oscillation, which is to avoid all the traffic shift from one link to another link due to the notification of the congestion status. So the route policy can be set as exit router so that this community is only conveyed to some of the routes, conveyed with some only subset of the routes, or you can configure that this policy is only configured for a specific part of the peers. And also, if the congestion status extended community is used by a SDN controller, the controller can steer the internet traffic among all the exit links. So this is also can be used with the SDN architecture. So for the INR, we would need one subtype from the 4-octet AI-specific extended community. So here we suggest a number, but we should ask for early allocation if it is adopted and becomes stable. Okay, so this has been presented twice in the IDR working group, and we think it's becoming stable. We'd like to ask for some working group adoption, and comments are welcome.
Hannes Gredler, RT Brick. Actually, adding dynamic version, adding dynamic bandwidth on top of prefixes is actually a problematic thing, right? I already could see some of the network operators really getting frightened because of this. That is number one. Number two is, how does that stuff work with existing implementations, for example, the link bandwidth community?
Okay.
And third, a suggestion wouldn't be, BGPLS with all the TE extensions in place, where we already using Stefano's extensions, we can report the utilization of a link just as we could do on interior links be the more appropriate way of doing things, especially considering controller architectures.
Okay. So you mean that BGPLS currently can advertise the utilization information of the link already?
Yeah, we can. It's pretty cool.
Okay. Thank you.
So, Job Snyder's NTT. At this point, I would not support working group adoption because I feel that the tool is somewhat malformed. There are things like AIGP or path prepending or MED. There are various tricks to manipulate traffic. Another observation is a peer does not need to tell me that the port is full. My management systems can pull the interface and we can see that it's utilized for 100%.
Yeah.
And based on that polling information, I can deploy routing policy and steer traffic to other interconnection points. So the utilization factor that is encoded in the extended community is superfluous information because it doesn't tell me anything new. As a joke, maybe it would be interesting to explore putting a congestion capability in the session opening, so we know from the start that the session will be congested.
Okay, so I just want to answer some of the questions, because we can see in this diagram the congestion link is not directly connected to the router which want to steer the traffic. So you cannot directly pull the link to know this utilization of this axis link because it's connected to another AS, right? Here the router X need to steer the traffic through another axis link. But the congestion happens on the link between the backbone and the internet. So this is a case, maybe.
The common best practice, as I understand it, between operators is the moment I hand over a packet, it is your responsibility to guide that packet. And
yeah.
Any subsequent maybe I'm misunderstanding a part here. Is this community meant between two ASNs on eBGP or purely IBGP?
It can be propagated inside the AS and also between the neighboring AS. Like in this,
Why don't you explain in this diagram which router is advertising the congestion community?
Okay, in this diagram, the router I, you can see this diagram. The router I connect to the access link will advertise this information inside the backbone AS, and then it will be propagated to the router X inside another AS. So the router X can steer the traffic through another access link, not going through the backbone, directly go to the internet. This is existing scenario in the operator's network. They have the multiple access link to the internet. Okay.
And I would like to emphasize the comment that the previous speaker made, that putting very volatile information, such as a utilization factor in BGP, you mentioned that escalation could be a risk, and I think that is a real risk and might be disruptive to some parts of the routing system.
Yeah, this information will not be used for all the prefixes, just for some specific one. It's configurable, so you can just steer traffic for some specific customers in which we need high performance requirement, right? This is finer granularity compared with the link level information advertisement. Some of the traffic still goes through this backbone, but some will go through the direct link to the internet.
Robert Raszuk, can you come back to this encoding diagram? Yeah. So for bandwidth, you are using 1 octet.
Yes.
And the unit is in gigabits per second. So assume I have 10,000 sites, which actually Bloomberg has, and we have E1s, T1s, and 10 megs even for customer sites. How do you encode that?
Yeah, you mean that this 1 byte is not enough, right? Yeah. We can change the unit to 10 gig because this is a link between the ASs. It can be a multiple of 10 gig at least.
Could you return to your prior page? Yes, so here.
Okay.
So the thing that I'm confused about in your proposal, Jeff, sorry, is what route would you attach this community to?
What route? It is through the configuration policy. So based on policy, you can choose to attach this information to specific prefixes.
So my observation, and this goes a little to what Hannes was saying about using BHBLS as a more natural thing. The property you're conveying, at least in your diagram, is between router 1 and router A, there is congestion.
Yes.
And that congestion is a property of the link, not necessarily of the set of prefixes that go over the link. If the prefix that you were attaching was the link IP address that's shared between 1 and A, that does make some sense because that is property of a link as mapped to a IP address. Otherwise, mapping it to a BHBLS link between things makes a little more sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. For most cases, this is a link property, right? But if you want to control the at the prefix level, you want to just steer traffic for some prefix, but leave some other prefix still on this link. This is maybe a different scenario, right?
Jonathan Looney. I have 2 observations. The first one is that if you are deploying this over a long path crossing the internet, you might end up with multiple of these situations where you want to signal congestion, and therefore you're making the oscillation problem even worse, and you're also you have to define the behavior of how nodes should deal with multiple copies of this. The other thing is that it's not just an oscillation problem with advertising the path and how many times you're going to change the path attributes. There's also a route compression problem. So if you apply this to particular prefixes, you're now potentially decreasing the number of prefixes that you can compress into the number of prefixes that will share the same path attributes. So you may end up, it's not just an oscillation problem, but you're going to end up with more announcements as well. So it really is a serious problem that probably needs to be addressed.
Okay.
Randy Bush, IJ, speaking actually for myself, as opposed to the Jabber Scribe. We did notice the lack of metrics in BGP a few years back. It's always been kind of a pony. I think work in this area is useful, but I don't think this is ready for prime time. The two major problems I have are the ones Job mentioned, which is what's going to happen with convergence, and the one Jeff mentioned, which is I have two different, just take the simple case, I have two prefixes over that link and the metric disagrees. What do? The IDR working group, whether I like it or not, has a tradition of not accepting a working group draft as a working item until it's perfect. So I think there's useful work in this area, but the tradition of this group says it's probably not adoptable at this point.
Okay. Maybe we will consider more about the solution, but this is a real use case, right?
I have one comment I'd also like to make, and it's completely different from all the previous ones, but this one connects to the discussion of code points at the beginning of the meeting. The draft has a suggested code point in it, and you know, as we're now trying to encourage people, please don't put suggested code points in your draft. Okay. But I will also point out to you that the registry that you want that code point from, if you go look at the allocation policy in the registry, it is first come, first served. So actually all you have to do is fill out the form on the IANA page, and bingo, they'll give you a code point. So the chairs would be happy to work with you on getting that done.
Totally agree.
And John, if you're actually looking at it, my memory says that there's also a range that's also private in there as well.
Maybe so. I don't have it in front of me.
So if it's private, this gives you a place to experiment in.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
Did the ADs want to say something beforehand?
Right. Good afternoon, folks. My name is Keyur Patel, and I'm going to talk about BGP-based SPF. This is the draft I co-authored with folks at Cisco, LinkedIn, and Nokia. This draft was presented at last IETF, and I was told that there was a lot of fun. I missed out on that, so I thought I should present it again. On a serious note, I'm just going to talk about a quick overview of the draft and talk about the draft updates we have made. So the motivation is fairly straightforward. We've been looking at data centers, and we know that data centers have implemented some kind of a simplified layer 3 routing. All of these data centers are moving towards some kind of a centralized route control using some controller-based solution. And this is for simplified management or more effective management of the network. And from an operational simplicity standpoint of this networks, lot of these data centers, believe it or not, only use BGP as their routing protocol. So when you talk about route controllers in context of BGP, only BGP as a routing protocol, they have a very similar functionality as route reflectors. In sense that the controller may or may not reflect routes, but it will definitely act as a central database for policy enforcement, management, any debugging applications, etc. However, the way traditional route reflector differs is that the ones that are not in the forwarding path assumes that there is some kind of IGP running underneath it that will help resolve the next stops and its adjacencies. So for the MSDCs or DCs that have deployed BGP, only BGP as the routing protocol resolves this problem by establishing hop by hop adjacencies and sort of perform distance vector over it. This draft tries to solve this problem wherein you have route reflectors deployed in the data or route controllers deployed in the data center that only uses BGP as the routing protocol. So that's the scope of the draft. Now, when we talk about such deployments, there is an advantage of running a simplified BGP-based SPF over a traditional distance vector algorithm. And that is that each switch or a node, be it a TOR or a spine, will have a complete topology of the network. This is fairly interesting when you are trying to compute an underlay. Only the network failures need to be advertised, and you don't need to advertise any routes impacted by the link failures or node failures. For the fact that it's SPF, it tends to be better and it lends better optimal path selection. The advantages of BGP are obvious, that there are data centers that are only BGP, that only deploy BGP as a routing protocol. The protocol itself is fairly robust and scalable. There's a minimum learning curve. It has a reliable transport, guaranteed in-order delivery with incremental updates. So the transport in itself is fairly solid for BGP. There is no flooding involved here, and you can do selective filtering if you want, right? And lastly, it lends up to a multiple peering models, specifically for the controller-based topologies. So then what did we do in 0.1 version? Well, we defined new SAFIs. There was a bit of a concern of overloading LS SAFI. We don't have a religion in particular, but we thought a new SAFI would probably be more appropriate. The NLRI format of the new SAFI will be exactly the same as the LS format. Obviously, you need capability to exchange this new SAFI on the wire. Supports multiple peering model. And the thing that this new SAFI does is that it takes the best part decision process of BGP and it replaces with Dijkstra. So then what are the best part changes did we do here? Well, first of all, the next hop that we carry in the update message pretty much becomes useless. But we let it go through like a lot of other SAFIs in BGP does, so that you stay at the parity with RFC 4271. The decision process of phase 1 and 2 are being replaced by the SPF algorithm. The phase 3 process, which is a route dissemination, typically in a traditional SAFI only gets invoked after phase 1 and phase 2 have been completed. Well, with SPF, you can actually bypass that condition and you can announce it even before the best path, which is a Dijkstra that has been executed. So you could do that here. The only thing you need to ensure is that the recent, most updated versions of NLRIs and LSAs that you exchange through this update format gets to be announced which protocol takes care of it. From an SPF standpoint, it's actually it's greatly simplified for the fact that you only take into account here point-to-point links. You don't have to worry about pseudonodes or any complex cases here. For the fact that it's data centers. Scales fairly well. All the traditional features that you support on SPF are applicable here if you do it right. And since LS carries, the format of LS carries all these features, naturally we also support it since we adhere to the same LS format. Lastly, the LS format itself is a dual stack format, so we also support that. Where the work needs to be clarified is the interaction between this SAFI and any overlay SAFI that might use this SAFI for the next stop resolution. And we think that's a matter of local implementation policy. The peering models. The peering models, various peering models are supported here specifically in context of closed networks that runs in presence of controllers. Any link state discovery or liveness detection is outside the scope of BGP, has to be done separately. RR or a controller hierarchies are fully supported, except for the fact that when you do these hierarchies, you don't rely on the SPF itself. Lastly, in such big data centers, it is expected that the controllers will learn the configuration for the switches that it controls out of band, and it may end up pushing it as an initial state onto the switches, upon which switches will perform SPFs in a distributed fashion, and depending on the link status changes, the SPF would need to recalculate or reaccount that. So to summarize, this is a fairly straightforward change inside BGP. The scope of this is predominantly controlled for a controller-based data center networks. Questions?
Hi, Alvaro Rotana, Routing AD. It is very nice that you are reusing packet formats.
Thank you.
I like that part a lot. However, changing the selection process for SPF, you're really defining a different protocol. And I think that defining a different protocol is, of course, outside of the scope of IDR. You did, even though you're reusing packet formats, you did talk about a problem that you need to solve. And this could be one of the solutions for that problem. What I would really like to do is take the discussion of the problem and whether this is a potential solution or not outside of IDR. You know that we have, we chartered a couple of years ago RTWG to deal with things that we didn't know where they fit. I don't think this fits here. What I would like to do is take the discussion there, not wait for the next IETF necessarily, but in the next, I don't know, month or two, try and have a discussion there as to, is this a problem we want to solve in the routing area? And is this a solution, or are there other solutions that we should consider as well?
Cool.
And I just want to say this looks like it's a very popular one to ask questions and answers on. So if you want to get a question or comment in, get in line now, because the line will be cut in like 10 seconds.
Ms. Gredler, Keir, in Berlin, we had lots of controversy around how are you going to do flooding, right? Based on those slides, it looks to me that you just use BGP-LS as a sort of a northbound protocol to the controller, right? And you do not really exchange much information within fabric peers, right? Okay, can you a little bit describe more how the flooding works?
Yeah, please keep in mind I'm heavily jet lagged, but I'll try my best. So there is no flooding here. Since it's a point-to-point protocol, the switches would start to announce using LS format the local information to the controller, and the controller practically acts as a route reflector. I don't want to say route controller or route server for eBGP case, because route servers typically resides on the same LAN as the clients, versus route reflector could be in a different plane. And so what it does, it's think of it as a one-hop reflection down to the client.
Right. So no flooding through the fabric.
Precisely.
Purely through the controller. Okay.
Yeah.
Let me just say, because we talked about this, AC Lindum co-author,
if you remember the Berlin, we had multiple flooding models, and we decided this one made the most sense. So what you'd have is you'd have, you obviously don't want the topology to be dependent on this in order to deliver the BGP-LS. So you'd have like it would look in a data center like a hierarchical route reflector topology. And that allows you to, one advantage this would have over a traditional IGP is you'd have a much sparser set of connections at the expense of using something other than BGP to determine, discover links and do link liveness detection. Thank you.
So, Randy, we'll go.
I'm not Jabber.
Okay, it's okay though. We're just gonna go front, back, front.
Shia, Jay. You've solved the problem of why there's these stupid devices that don't do ISIS very well by dropping it into an SAFI. It propagates. I'm so about centralized controllers in a data center. Well, I'm a BGP lover, and it floods and scales well.
Indeed. We are in full agreement.
So,
in fact, we are in violent agreement.
no, I was raised by somebody who was a pacifist in World War II. And this may come again. But unusually, I don't have a strong negative feeling. This BGP scales.
Yes.
Sounded like wild praise.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Uma Chandure. So I have one question in section 4.3. It doesn't talk about the.
I'm sorry, I'm jet lagged. I don't know what section 4.3
So
is,
basically,
but I believe.
I'm talking about the metrics.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the metrics. It says that you can use the IGP metrics. It doesn't say that you can use the IGP metrics. It says that for non-SPF topologies, you should use the IGP metrics. That is 1065, what is defined by BGP-LS. My question is, why you didn't specify the link metrics and prefix metrics here? Because that's the central for your SPF calculation.
We made a mistake. You will give us a text, we'll incorporate it.
John Mitchell, Google. You mentioned the large-scale data center draft, and some of the requirements of that draft were easily implementable by multiple vendors in already existing commodity software. And I sort of wonder, looking at what you're trying to do here, you mentioned that you were trying to contain the scope of failures by using this to link failures and node failures rather than prefix distribution of large prefixes upon a failure. And I mentioned that in that draft, it specifically says that most failures do not propagate past one tier in the design. So what you've done here, it seems, is make it so that a thing in the topology that fails is now heard by everything in a gigantic, massive data center with maybe thousands of switches. I'm not sure that, I mean, if we wanted that, maybe we would just deploy ISIS or something.
Well,
like, why would we?
Well,
do
there are
this?
two big differences, right? So the draft that you talked about is the draft you've co-authored.
Of
the
course.
draft that you've co-authored believes that or assumes that every peering is in band, meaning you have a Tor doing an EBG peering with spine and so forth and so on.
Right.
We are taking those peerings off.
Okay, so guys, we're about out of time. So if everybody at the mic take 10 or 20 seconds to state a question, get an answer. If it's longer than that, we're going to have to take it to the interim meeting that Alvaro mentioned.
Can I quickly finish?
So you may
all right,
finish
so
up, but
I'm just going to quickly finish off the point I was making to John is that, so we take those peering to the controller for the fact that we assume there is a controller that's going to be present in the clause. And if we do that, the update goes to the controller and yes, it gets reflected out. Those updates inside controllers are cheap. They will go to everyone, yes. They hopefully will reach on they will definitely do the respinning of SPF, but your fibs won't be impacted at the end of the day.
Previous slide, please. No, the one after this, slide 9.
This?
Link discovery, liveliness detection outside of BGP. I object to this. Everything is in scope in BGP.
Thank you for that
All right.
comment.
And with that, we're out of time on this one. And we will, assuming that the interim that Alvaro mentioned is scheduled, we will absolutely announce it on the IDR list.
Thank you.
Hi. How many operators, could operators raise their hands? Right. Those operators who have never made a mistake configuring a router, keep your hands up. Yeah. Okay. So this draft tries to deal with that and deal with enforcing something I don't believe in, which is Gow Rexford Valley Free. Is that understood by everybody? No. Okay. If I get transit from Rudiger, I do not announce those prefixes to Yob. In other words, the Telecom Malaysia route leak, etc. Okay. How does it do it? At BGP open, both sides agree to what the relationship is. Transit providers, there's a clicker here, right? Do I have a foil on this? Maybe. Okay, so we enforce the relationship, peer, customer, etc., through protocol and not code. So I, of course, never make a mistake, but this could be my first one. Okay. The idea is I know that Yob is my provider. Yob knows I'm his customer. Hannes knows I'm his customer, or pardon me, it was Rudiger. And I know Rudiger is my provider. And code in the router, not communities, which can be misconfigured on a daily basis, enforces it. How it does it is a silly flag. Oh, here are the roles: provider, customer, peer, internal. And this lets me loosen things up inside. And there's this one, complex. I don't particularly like it. It's aptly named, but there's somebody here who wants it, so we're putting it in for the moment. There's this flag called IOTC. It's set when the receiver is a customer. I am a customer of Rudiger, I set the bit. I'm a customer of Yob, I set the bit. I cannot transmit to Yob something with that bit set, because he and I established at BGP Open that I was a customer. Note, both of us had to agree on the role, enforced by protocol and code, not by operator misconfiguration. Then, so there's actually two sets of things here. There's that and the same thing for peers, which is customer or peer can't leak to a transit provider, etc. There are also the even numbered rules, which are there because of complex. Complex is essentially the same thing except per prefix, because Yob wanted per prefix. It's complex. It's well named. Similarly, there is in this draft, though we question its need, let me point out here that since it is enforced right here, okay, right here, I will not do that. When Yob gets transit from Jen Linkova over there, Jen trusts Yob and my relationship and doesn't really need to remote diagnose whether I violated this. So here is if you want to remote diagnose and remote measure. There's another bit called external OTC. It's the same, but it's leaked. In other words, it stays as an attribute from the AS path. So Jen gets to see that I am Yob's customer, which I don't want her to see. But, so, there are two things to argue about so far. Complex is well named, and it makes the relationship weakly enforced. What's the difference between complex and no open at all? And do we need the EOTC, which is propagated, at all, because there's no, if you got this locked on the first hop, you're okay. Yob.
I can help you with the first question, what the difference is between complex and no BGP open rule setting. One is a lot of work, and the other is what I have today. So I would remove it from the draft.
You don't need complex. Does anybody want complex? Any operator want complex?
I consider all the BGP sessions that I have complex, and as such, I would either mark all of them complex or not negotiate the capability. And I can elaborate a little bit on why this is. Not everybody may agree with this, but I've noticed that not all our BGP peers, and then peers in the sense of this is the machine or organization I have the TCP session with. Not all of them view their role or piece in the ecosystem as being a customer. But from my perspective, it's a customer. And I see this in support tickets constantly, where people have very interesting assumptions about how the relation is developed. So negotiating with them on who is what can be complex. So not negotiating that would save considerable time. And there's a second issue for not setting the relation at the beginning when you provision the session. The relation might change over time, and then you need your peer to cooperate with you to change his role accordingly.
You're running Cisco's, it'll bounce the session anyway.
Right, but we would need Cisco's on both sides and something to...
either side.
So I'd just like to observe that we're over time. I don't mind letting it run for a little longer as long as people are willing to hang out, but...
Why don't you let Kayer have a shot?
I was just going to comment that if you have to renegotiate, put it in GR and renegotiate it. Lock down your fibs and ribs, and it's a session bounce. We have a standard.
Yeah. No, nobody's asking by the way, the two to go to their business people and deal with what the relationship is. The question is it a valley or not? You're just trying to prevent valley violations. And I've seen the configurations of some very large providers. The one case I worried about is if I'm in Germany and I offer some local provider German routes peering and international transit. And the only configurations I'm aware of actually run 2 sessions, which means the complex is not really needed. That's the case that I worried about would need complex. But anyway, John's beating us up. Oops, or is this kind of walking forward?
No beatings are being administered yet.
Pardon?
I said no beatings are being administered yet. You can keep talking as long as you keep your audience.
Monte Apple. So I hear, Randy, what you're saying about the 2 sessions. being used as a means for both transit and, say, domestic routes. I can speak to other configurations which deliver the same over a single session. So
Then
they do
that's-
exist. They are in production.
That speaks for complex.
That speaks for complex. Correct.
I hear you.
I want to make it clear that I do appreciate dialogue and thought on this topic. We've had the RPL bit. There's been another mitigation which is discussed in this draft. There's this draft itself. So there clearly is an itch that could be scratched. And therefore, I would like to thank you and the authors for bringing this up and making it available for discussion.
No extra charge.
John Mitchell again, Google. An observation, if this is meant to be configured as a per session sort of configuration, maybe the default for every box shipped should really be that all sessions by default are customer when this is put out, because otherwise, if this is a single configuration knob you apply per session, to me, that's really not that different than getting my one line import policy, whether it says import the pure policy or the transit policy, wrong. To me, you say that no mistakes will be made once you have this, but I think it's exactly the same line of code that will be made a mistake on. So
2 comments. One is, if you ship all boxes with customers, no peering will come up.
It's configurable per session to change that, of course.
Right.
Yep.
The other is, policy is what got us into Telkom Malaysia, what got us into 7007, the long list of route leaks. People have been screaming about route leaks.
Some of those are due to missing policy, which is solved by another
Or wrong
document.
policy.
Yes.
Missing is a form of wrong.
Sure. But it's also solved by another draft that we've got as a working group document now.
You'll
the retech
notice
draft,
the
right?
authors on that other draft have moved to this draft. And the reason is that draft was communities, right? It's like what Kayer's previous presentation, I said he'd moved ISIS into a SAFI. This moves those communities into a BGP open. So it's locked down by code.
I guess I'm asking, can you lock it down by default? Because otherwise, I don't see the people who are making the mistakes configuring this knob. But you know,
So what you're saying is please specify that it's customer by default? That's easy.
Yeah.
I'm not sure of the win.
Okay. Now I'm going to start beating people up. So Rudiger, Jared, and let's be done.
Yeah. I like to see the classification, and having a peering or open session requiring a knob, I think, is not a bad thing. My customer should not need to do anything.
Which I think,
My ops,
that was the point.
my
To which
ops
he was
always
going.
will have to do something.
That's not an unreasonable point. Yeah.
Jared Mach. So I like this. I don't recall seeing an adoption call for this yet. I would certainly support adopting this, and this is, I think, necessary work to close the gaps that the vendors have been unable to address for the operator community up to this point in securing routing.
Yeah, but it's not just the vendor's fault. We've all blown it, but it's time to try to keep out of the New York Times. We'll leave that to our new president.
Absolutely, but I'd like to see some of the vendors.
We're in Korea, Randy. Which new president are you talking about? Anyway, so
Actually, the resolution they're planning is the president's going to appoint a prime minister.
So thank you. I think it would be great to have that conversation about adopting it on the mailing list. We are now well over Ahmad. I'm sorry, we're not going to have time. We tried. Please, if you please take a look at the slides. They're available, and I'm sure we'll be getting back to this topic that we were not able to fit into our schedule.
Good job. Good.
Hey, I got an interop of large communities at the front here. If you want to connect to my laptop, you can interrupt large communities.
Yeah, sure. I know.
Hey.
Set up the even the Zebra is set up.
No, I've got my.
Okay, let's do it. We should chat. I don't want to catch up with you.
Which one?
I'll send you a note. Don't go.
This is
Sorry.
PRSCK Mintex.
Yes.